civilian protection. And you can ask a question, what is civilian protection? You guys all signed up for this class, for this lecture, but maybe not fully knowing what it is. And so civilian protection is a new field, and it's a blend of some existing fields. It's actually a cross-cutting issue. So it blends things like human rights, security policy, and also humanitarian assistance. And in fact, the course that I teach here counts as an elective for all of those programs. So whether you're security, human rights, humanitarian assistance, that course would be a valuable course for you. And in fact, in the class, one of the nice things about it is we have a mix of students from all over the map in terms of programs, but also experience. So we often get people who have done previous work with NGOs or people or Peace Corps people, but also former or current military people who have had some experience in the field from the military side. So oftentimes this course provokes some pretty interesting discussions. This week we had General George Casey giving a guest lecture on his experience with civilian protection in the U.S. Army. Next week we have a speaker from an NGO coming as well. So it's a pretty fun course. One thing to note about civilian protection is that it's different from a concept that you may have also heard of called human security. Have you guys heard of human security before? Does this ring a bell, kind of? Yeah, so Brad has, good. So human security, what is that? That's basically an effort to shift the focus from security of states to security of individuals, and placing the primacy of security of individuals sometimes over and above sovereignty of states, so that protecting civilians becomes a priority. And one thing that people who study human security are very interested in is what happens to civilians. When are civilians insecure? When are they insecure? Where is human security the gravest concern around the world? But one thing that human security does not necessarily do is tell you how to protect people or tell you how to improve human security. And so a protection approach takes, in a sense, a more causal approach instead of a descriptive approach. So we're trying to understand what causes violence and then what mechanisms, what protection mechanisms are there to prevent violence so that civilians that are at risk can ultimately avoid violence. And so why study this as a field? One is to try to identify direct actions or mechanisms to protect civilians that are under threat. And then more deeply, the civilian protection field focuses a lot on how, well, at least my version of it, focuses a lot on what armed actors are doing, because they're often the main perpetrators of violence. And so to understand why violence is occurring, you need to understand what armed actors are doing and why they're committing violence. And also, this is an increasingly timely issue, and it's kind of a new field. This transition from human security to civilian protection is a new field, and we're still learning a lot about it. But it's definitely something that's in the headlines. And I took the liberty of pulling some headlines just from yesterday. This is actually all from yesterday. And one of the interesting things about this course is that we're able to discuss current events, instances of civilian protection that are going on right now, or violence against civilians, and think about how our models and theories and explanations can deal with these cases. And so you can see here, today Lebanon hosts over 1 million who fled Syria, so we know there's an ongoing refugee crisis. What can be done to increase civilian protection within that very dangerous conflict? Yesterday, Chad peacekeepers decided they would leave the Central African Republic after an incident where approximately 30 civilians were killed, supposedly by those peacekeepers. And so this is sort of a big scandal and a big question as well, as how can the UN do the best job it can to protect civilians when it's in a peacekeeping situation. And then also, as you may have heard of, there's a growing insurgency in Nigeria, the Boko Haram insurgency. And so you have a number of NGOs putting out reports on problems that civilians face, how severe violence is, not always necessarily applying existing theory or mechanisms to protect civilians, and sometimes overlooking some of the academic literature that has thought a little bit more deeply about this. So that's one of the nice things about this course, is that we dig into this a lot more deeply than most NGOs, at least from a sort of a theoretical argument and a breadth around the globe. So I'm just going to show you this slide here to give you an overview of what the course looks like. So our sessions here are 10-week quarters, and so we usually have 9 weeks of content, and then often in the last week, students will present their projects that they've developed throughout the quarter. So in this class, students pick a community or a group or sometimes a country and try to design a protection strategy that fits the conditions of that particular group. So we've had students do papers on the Druze in Syria, on civilians in Nigeria. Someone actually last year did a very timely paper on protecting civilians in the Central African Republic. And so there are a lot of cutting edge papers going on. Some of these I go back to as useful reference material if I'm ever trying to write an opinion piece or a blog post. I'm like, oh, this student did a lot of really good research that I can learn from. So that's pretty nice. So just to go through the weeks here. So week 1, we talk about what is protection and what is violence, what kinds of violence are there, and where does protection fit among the spectrum of causes of violence. Week 2, we discuss what are the main theories out there of violence or explanations for why armed actors do what they do. What is the logic or different logics of violence? And we're going to touch on that briefly today. Week 3, which is actually this week, is thinking about civilian experiences in conflict and violence. And oftentimes, civilians get caught up in a variety of collective action problems where rebel groups are trying to recruit them, they're trying to organize their own communities, militaries are also organizing in different ways to deal with civilians. And so there's some interesting collective action and allegiance dynamics and effects that conflicts have on civilian communities that we need to understand in order to understand the prospects for protection. Week 4, so after this, we basically take a look each week at different aspects of the protection architecture that's out there. And this is mainly organized by actors. Week 4, we look at what's the role of international law for protecting civilians or sometimes failing to protect civilians. How do UN peacekeepers operate to protect civilians? What's the role of NGOs specifically in helping civilians avoid violence? How does armed civilian protection function? And this is considering things like paramilitaries that arm, as well as local civilian defense units. And then we have this week's topic, which is unarmed civilian protection, so we'll get into that in a minute. And then we conclude with the state. So instead of putting the state first, we sort of look at that last, even though, in a way, responsibility to protect lies with states first. And so we think that states are the primary actors. But oftentimes, once civilians are in a violent situation, it's because the state hasn't taken action to begin with. And so we want to make sure that we're not just looking at the state, but we're considering all the different ways that civilians might gain protection. So let's get into just a little bit of the content, and I'm going to give you guys a crash course about why civilians are killed. This is the starting part, and then we'll talk about the unarmed aspect. And so I'm going to talk about one main theory, but there are really a number of explanations out there in the literature. The one we're going to talk about today is this selective targeting of civilians, where basically civilians are targeted for strategic reasons. But there's also explanations of abusive violence. There's explanations of genocide or draining the sea, targeting entire populations. There's collateral damage, so accidental harm that happens during combat or other operations. And you can think of a number of other explanations as well. I'm not going to get into all of those. But one thing that these different explanations raise is the question of whether or not violence is rational or irrational. Or for example, is violence simply barbaric, or is it very strategic, or is it somewhere in between? Why is violence occurring? And these different explanations have different answers to that question. And one of the questions we think about is how do these types of violence blend together? Are they always separate? Do they contradict each other? That kind of thing. And then so we ask also, what are the motivations to use violence? If it's rational or irrational, why are people doing what they're doing? And then how can you address those motivations? And so one of the main explanations we have out there for violence comes from a book by an author, Stathis Kalibas, a political scientist, who talks about the logic of violence and civil war. So he sees violence as largely rational and strategic. So he says, just from the title, there's a logic to it. And the violence that he looks at is the violence that occurs in the fog of war. And so the problem that armed groups or armed actors, militaries face when fighting, especially in a regular war like an insurgency, is that it's hard to know who's who, because there are no courts in these often functioning in these war zones. There is not good information about who's doing what. And so you end up with this problem of not knowing who is an enemy supporter and who is supporting you, or who is maybe just doing nothing and trying to get by. So this creates a real problem. And armed groups, according to this theory, use violence selectively. And they're using it to target their enemy, the supporters of their enemy, or people who defect to their enemies. So if you're a government, you're trying to target insurgent supporters, and only them, because you want to use that violence for a strategic reason. This also, however, is an explanation of indiscriminate or mass violence, because there are also times when armed groups are unable to use violence selectively. And when that happens, you end up getting what's more like a mass atrocity or very indiscriminate violence targeting large groups of people. So we can talk for a minute about what is selective violence. And selective violence is really designed to coerce. It's a coercive strategy. It's using threats of violence or actual violence to gain support. Okay? So you're killing one individual, you're targeting one individual, but the idea there is to send a message. So if you identify one person who is a rebel supporter and you target them, that sends a signal to everybody else that if you also support the insurgents, you are going to be targeted as well. So it has this deterrent coercive capacity there. So oftentimes, as I mentioned, this violence is used to target enemies, suspected enemies, and it requires a lot of information. So you need to know who's who, who's doing what, who is an enemy supporter, and who's not. And this creates a real problem. One other point to make about this type of selective violence is that it is, according to this theory, very interpersonal. And so you can see from the cover of this book, it's not two armies fighting, it's two guys wrestling here, right? So you have two guys fighting each other face to face. It's a very intimate form of violence, and I'll talk about that on the next slide here. So one of the key points of this theory, and this is the only, I think, other slide I have on this topic, is for today, is that violence is jointly produced. And so violence is produced both by civilians and armed actors. So it's not just armed actors like a military or a rebel group or a paramilitary group carrying out violence, but it's also the civilians involved here. And so in this model that Kalibas posits, there's competition between two armed actors. Often he calls them the incumbents, or the state, or the military, and the insurgents. And these different actors want different things, but armed actors in general, he says, they want denunciations from the population. So they want information. They want someone to denounce an enemy supporter to them, an insurgent supporter to them. And what do they have to guarantee a denunciation? They have protection. They have a coercive, violent capacity, right? So if they can say to someone, look, if you come and give us information, we will make sure that you don't get harmed or that someone does not counter-denounce you to the rebels. Okay, does that make sense? You guys with me so far? All right, good. Now, civilians have another part of this bargain to play. So Kalibas sees civilians as intimately involved in the production of violence. So civilians want protection, and by contrast, civilians have information. Civilians are the local actors. They're more present. They know what's going on in their communities, and they can often tell who is basically transgressing against an armed actor like the state forces, the military. So if you're a villager and you're sitting in your village and you see someone giving aid to insurgents passing in the night, you might know that because the military is not around all the time to see that, but then you can take that information to the military. So that's the basic process of how violence occurs in this model and how information is managed. So armed actors are trying to cultivate information from civilians. One key moving variable or parameter of this model is that the ability of armed actors to use coercion and the ability of them to protect civilians and the incentives for civilians to give information is greatly shaped by the zones of control that armed actors have. So when armed actors have complete control, they don't necessarily need information because they already have control. By contrast, when there's very little control, people are threatened from multiple sides, and they can be very unwilling to give information. So there are certain conditions when an armed group has some amount of control, they're trying to get more, and they're able to protect certain people to weed out the people that are transgressing against them, or the people that are passing information or giving assistance to the enemy group. So in that case, the government might protect certain individuals who are giving them information about where the insurgents are moving. So the main point of this joint production of violence is that it creates a big problem for communities and civilians. And one problem is that the community ends up participating in the conflict by giving information or by giving support. And this is a problem because when lines of control shift, people who are giving support to one actor all of a sudden become endangered by another actor. And this can cause a community to turn on itself. So people are basically split with allegiances. Some people are helping one side, some people are helping another, and the community ends up essentially tearing itself apart. So people are turning each other into armed groups and they're getting targeted. Another big problem here is that if you look back at the picture in the book, you have civilians that are using these armed actors and their ability to use violence to settle their own scores. So that's why you get this very interpersonal violence, because oftentimes people will use an armed actor to take some advantage within the community. Let's say they're trying to take someone's land, or they're trying to take revenge against someone who had an affair with their wife or something like that. So they often have these very personal scores that often have nothing to do with the main conflict. So people are not being targeted because they're rebel supporters, they're being targeted because someone has a grudge against them. Okay. So we can talk about one way that civilians can deal with this problem. And one of the ways that I've identified in my research is an information mechanism. And this information mechanism allows civilians to short-circuit violence. And so I'm going to briefly tell you this counter theory, which is a way to interrupt or short-circuit the process of selective violence. And in this mechanism, there are just a few main premises. One, you have to believe that violence is costly to both armed groups and the community. So it's obviously costly to a community when someone is harmed. But armed groups, when they misuse violence, can also suffer reputational costs. They can lose support. There's some incentive to be more precise in their targeting. Secondly, you have to believe, or has to be a situation, where civilian organizations can have advantages in local information about who's doing what, and can use that information to identify enemy collaborators for armed actors. So a community itself is going to leverage the information that they have about who's doing what within this context of the fog of war. And then armed actors can value this information because policing civilians is difficult. So it's very hard to monitor who's doing what, and if they can trust a civilian community to ensure that people are not defecting against them to the enemy group, this information can be very useful and can be a benefit. So armed groups will have an incentive to abide by this informational process. And an implication of these premises here is that violence can be limited in at least two ways. So one, it can keep armed groups from making mistakes in targeting. So they're not just targeting people because someone has a grudge against them. They may end up targeting people who truly are members of the insurgency or members of the military or spies for the military. So they're not just targeting people wantonly. They're targeting people more selectively. They're making fewer mistakes. However, given this extra information flow, it also creates disincentives for people to give information to armed groups or to collaborate with armed groups, because once they do this, they could be outed. They could be identified as being an enemy supporter and then be targeted. So this greater transparency actually limits the amount of engagement that civilians will have with armed actors and reduce the risks that that the community in general faces. Okay, this is what I was going to be talking about. So I've done a lot of field work in Colombia to try to figure out how these processes work. And I've studied one community in particular where I've been able to document this process, which is in the community of La India in the Department of Santander, where I've evaluated a number of villages and neighboring towns. This is about 100 miles north of Bogota, but about a day and a half of bus and a lot of car sickness. It's not pleasant to get there, but once you get there, it's really hot. So, but the people are very nice. So, and they've developed a pretty interesting peace movement. So, this is actually the village of La India. You can see it sort of from an aerial view. It's very small. It's on a river here called the Carari River, which runs into the longest river in Colombia, known as the Magdalena River. And this set of villages is arrayed along a number of rivers and tributaries. And so an interesting thing about this community is that they do have very good communication across small villages. They're able to navigate along the river, even though there aren't a lot of roads in this area. It's a very undeveloped area. But they're able to maintain this network of information across different villages, which gives them an advantage for dealing with the armed groups. And so you can see that in a number of villages in Colombia, but also around the world, there have been increasing amounts of protests against armed groups by nonviolent protests by unarmed civilians. And in India, they had these kinds of protests as well in the late 1980s. And when they had these protests, the idea was to basically sign some agreements with armed groups to get them to abide by the investigations mechanism, or to get them to agree to use the civilians' information and not just target people all over the place. And so you can see some evidence of armed actors actually complying with this information mechanism. And I was able to find some accounts from archives where community leaders had taken notes when they met with paramilitary commanders. And you can see accounts of paramilitary commanders being very cognizant of the agreements that they made with the villages. And so you can see here a paramilitary commander from the archive. He said, "We believe we are complying with the accords to abide by the investigations mechanism. The campesino, the peasant, has problems when he compromises himself with the guerrillas. He who dedicates himself just to his family doesn't have to worry." That's not a threat, it's a suggestion. And so you can see here that in this case, the commanders are taking into account the civilian process and mainly want to prevent people defecting from their group, and to the extent that the civilian community and their unarmed, nonviolent information process can help that, they're willing to abide by it. And the data that I collected from this community suggests that. You also see some examples for in Afghanistan as one instance where the US military actually relied heavily on communities in certain parts of the country to police members of the Taliban and the insurgency who were reintegrating into their communities. And they relied on communities and tribal elders to monitor these individuals to make sure that they were not still participating in the insurgency. So you see some similar dynamics in different places. One problem you'll note is that these can be very difficult to identify.